just realized that I never actually say the name of my channel in my videos. I should change that. Hi, I am Kelsey. This is my booktube channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing my fancy hat, and today I'm bringing you my wrap-up for the month of May. Today, in addition to my fancy hat, I'm also wearing my Nancy Drew shirt, which I thought you might like to see because it is bookish, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with any of the books I read this month. None of them were even vaguely Nancy Drew-like, but still, I have a bookish t-shirt and I'm wearing it. I also recently reorganized my bookshelves a bit, so I have some more photogenic full series things here on the top shelf. I'm hoping this ends up looking a little better than what I had before. I'll see when I edit the video. But I've got some space on the front here, so I put like a little candle here, and I thought maybe here where I've got this like hidey hole in my books that I need to cover, I should like cycle through my mass market paperbacks, because the mass market paperbacks never get properly displayed on booktube videos and they need some love. So I might just cycle through my videos from now on, putting a different mass market paperback in front of my hopefully photogenic book display from now on. We'll see if that works. So that's all of the random whatnots I wanted to say at the beginning of this video. Now let's get into the books I read in the month of May. I had a really frighteningly long TBR for the month of May, but I thought I'd be able to read them all just because a lot of them were books that I thought I would read very quickly, and I was actually right. It was actually the perfect amount of reading for me for the month. I got through all of them in exactly the amount of time that I thought I would. I finished the final book I had on that TBR right at the end of the month, so if you watched my TBR, you know exactly what's going to be in this wrap-up. The first book I finished was Dreams of Gods and Monsters by Laini Taylor. This is the third and final book in her Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. This was a really solid trilogy for me. I gave all three of the books a 4-star rating, this one included. I have not yet done my series review for this, so that's hopefully going to be coming very soon. Watch out for it. In the meantime, I think what I'm going to tell you about this book is that it introduces a new character named Eliza, who I really liked. I thought her point of view chapters were really refreshing, a new thread in this story. If you'll recall, I thought that the second book was really, really brutal. This one I interestingly thought was a little less so, even though there are still big epic things happening, which sort of defies the trend that I see in trilogies, which is that the final book is usually the one with all of the big bloody battles in it. So I thought it was kind of cool that this conclusion to this trilogy sort of avoided that generic narrative and did some interesting different things. The main romance in this book really does get a little overwrought and boring as the series goes on, but I still love Carew as a protagonist, and I really liked a lot of what was happening with the supporting characters in this book. So I'll definitely want to continue reading Laini Taylor's writing. She's got a few books that she wrote before the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy that I really want to read, and she's got a new duology coming out that I'm very excited for, so I'm really happy about this. The next book I've got here was one that I started reading at the end of April, and then I finished reading it in May, and that is Her Fearful Symmetry by Audrey Niffenegger. This is the author of The Time Traveler's Wife, and this really looks like it's marketed as like, if you liked The Time Traveler's Wife, here's the next book that'll be just like it by the same author. It's been a really long time since I've read The Time Traveler's Wife, so I don't remember it that clearly. This one, I think a lot of people who really like The Time Traveler's Wife don't like this one. I had some really mixed feelings about it. This started out for me feeling like it might end up being a 5-star book for like the first third of this book. It's this kind of mysterious, atmospheric story with a cast of really eccentric, quirky characters, and I really took to all of the characters. I think Audrey Niffenegger writes eccentric people and academics and so forth in wacky and compassionate ways that I really like. So those were like mostly the secondary characters, and then the main characters are these twins, Julia and Valentina Poole. They are mirror image twins, both physically and personality-wise. and they are very dependent on each other. They're about 20 years old or so, and they inherit their aunt's flat in London and move from Chicago to London to live in it. Their aunt was their mother's twin sister. So I really like this idea of like 20-year-old girls moving to live in London, and I really identified with both of the twins as characters who were in about my age range. So this started off really fabulously great for me. It is a paranormal ghost story, but that element started off being really light in the book, and it built and built to be bigger and bigger towards the end. And I feel like it would be really weird of me to say that I didn't like the paranormal element, because if you watch my channel, you know that I read a whole lot of fantasy and not a lot of contemporary. So I'm not sure what to think about the fact that as the fantasy element grew, I got more and more distanced from this story, and I found myself strangely feeling like I would have preferred this as just like a quirky, eccentric, atmospheric contemporary, which is very strange for me. So I'm not totally sure what to make of my own reaction to this book. I will say I was still very much liking it most of the way through until almost the very end. It was more of like a 4-star book territory for me. And then at the very end, it kind of just went over the cliff of strangeness for me in a way that, I mean, I usually really like strange books, but somehow for me it just distanced me from how deeply I felt about these characters. And I felt like the way this ended, I should have felt more feelings about what it meant for the characters than I did, given how much I had cared about them initially. So I ended up giving this 3 stars. I do think you might like this if you like kind of creepier ghost stories. Yeah, mixed feelings. Next book. Okay, the next book I read was Nimona by Noelle Stevenson. This is a graphic novel, as I've mentioned before. I had never read any graphic novels before in my life except for Persepolis, which I read for school, and I feel like reading for school sometimes just doesn't count. So I'm calling this my first graphic novel. This has gotten a huge amount of hype and rave reviews, and it's also a standalone instead of like part of a comic book series, so that's part of what drew me to this. It's young adult, and it is like a fantasy superhero thing. It's about a girl named Nimona who is a shapeshifter, and she manages to attach herself as a sidekick to her local supervillain, Ballister Blackheart, and she is super pumped about all this super villainy. Not all is exactly as it seems in the relationship between Lord Blackheart and his arch nemesis, the city's champion, who is the hero Sir Ambrosius Goldenloin. The Institute for Heroics, I don't remember if that's exactly what it's called, but basically the Institute might be hiding some nefarious secrets, and Nimona herself might not be exactly what she seems to be either. So I was a little skeptical. I'm not a big fan of like traditional comic book art styles, and this didn't seem like it was going to really visually appeal to me until I started actually reading this and noticing how much is really actually very visually clever. So like even in the first couple pages, you've already got this really fascinating world-building hybrid of like contemporary urban cityscapes with some sort of sci-fi-ish technology with this sort of medieval knights thing going on. So like here you've immediately got dragons and skyscrapers and giant robots all in one little picture. You've got super villains and heroes and guards dressed like medieval knights. And you've got Nimona herself in a costume that's like a medieval chainmail tunic but styled in a really contemporary way with like fuzzy-looking hipster socks and an edgy hairdo. And so that, as someone who is new to graphic novels, just really struck me as the sort of intense, really fascinating, quirky, unusual, interesting world building that a regular novel would have to take an incredible amount of words and space to establish, whereas something like this can establish all of that so quickly with just a few pictures on a page and then just run with it without having to really stop and discuss it or explain it. And it works so well that you don't even stop to question it. And that's not really what I've heard people talking about in booktube reviews in relation to this graphic novel. Maybe it's something that is super obvious to anyone who actually reads a lot of graphic novels, and it's only standing out to me because I don't, and this was a new experience for me. What I do hear people praising a lot is the story. I see this as a sort of celebration of characters who don't fit within the traditional story narratives available to them. I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars, and I will definitely, I think, now be continuing to read some graphic novels in the future. The next book I read in the month was Lirael by Garth Nix. This is obviously all 3 books, but I did only read the middle one. I read Sabriel last summer, and Sabriel does kind of work as a standalone, and then it seems like the second 2 books, Lirael and Pearson, behave a little more like a sequel duology. Lirael takes place a generation after the events of Sabriel. These are, by some standards, slightly older YA, given that YA is, as we know it, hasn't really been around that long. So these were published from 1995 to 2003, so these were around and very popular when I was in high school, but I didn't read them then. I'm glad I'm reading them now. I think Garth Nix's writing in these books is really solid, and so it holds up pretty well against the YA fantasy that's being published right now. There's actually a storyline in Lirael that has to do with refugees that feels really timely right now. I think the coolest part of these books is the world building and magic system stuff. This centers around a country called the Old Kingdom that behaves very much like a fantasy kingdom in the world where the rest of the world doesn't have magic and more resembles the technology of the mid-20th century in the real world. We see both the Old Kingdom and their neighboring country in these books, and part of the through line is how people outside the Old Kingdom really don't understand how the Old Kingdom works and what the dangers are of the magic they have there and how it's all going amok. Lirael introduces a new protagonist whose name is Lirael. She is a daughter of the Clare, who are the prophetic bloodline in the Old Kingdom, but Lirael doesn't fit in because she hasn't gotten her sight. Early in this book, there is a magical library, and that speaks to me. I find that books with magical libraries earn bonus points for me because, hey, magical libraries. Unfortunately, we do leave the magical library behind and go on some adventures in this book. I don't know if it's too much to hope that we'll make it back to the magical library of the Clare in the 3rd book. I'm not getting my hopes too high, but maybe it'll happen. And if you know, don't tell me. I don't want to know. There's a second point of view protagonist in this book named Sam, and I don't think there's anything more I can really tell you about him without spoilers for Sabriel. There were a couple things that bugged me a little about this book. It does this thing that sort of set up books do in a series where it takes a long time alternating between the two main characters' points of view before they meet each other, and to me that kind of makes it feel like you've got two half books instead of like a cohesive book. The other thing, well, first I should say that one of the things I really like about the world building of this series is the really sort of unusual magical elements, and I had been anticipating seeing sort of more of the prophetic magic of the Clare and the charter magic of the Old Kingdom, but it is the Pearson Chronicles, so it does keep centering back around the Pearson, which are the necromantic bloodline, and while there's really some fascinating, cool descriptions of how that works, it does kind of lend itself to repeated sequences of, oh my gosh, let's fight more Evil Dead things, the Evil Dead things are after us again. And I was kind of hoping that the Evil Dead things would let up a bit in the second book so that we could see more of the charter magic and the other stuff that's in this world. And then it kind of slid back into let's fight more Evil Dead things, which I think is gonna be like the point of the whole series. But I did think the writing was really strong, and I really enjoyed the characters and of course the magical library, and I enjoy the world building, and it's mostly all good, and I gave Lirael 4 stars, which is the same rating I gave Sabriel. Next book I read was Peter and the Starcatchers by Dave Barry and Ridley Pearson. This is the first book in a middle grade fantasy adventure series that is a Peter Pan prequel origin story thing. I read this firstly because I've been wanting to read more middle grade fantasy, but also specifically this book, which I don't think I would have otherwise picked up, because I saw the stage adaptation that played on Broadway a few years ago, and I absolutely adored it. The stage play was called Peter and the Starcatcher. I have this annotated script of the Broadway play. This is just a really cool book with great photo spreads. It also has some commentary and costume sketches and stuff. And I went to a book signing event for this, and I got it signed by 3 of the actors in the cast, as well as Ridley Pearson, who's one of the authors of this book, and Rick Ellis, who wrote the stage adaptation. So the book is middle grade, but the play was for an adult audience, and it was, I think, more riotously funny. There was a good deal of physical comedy, but I also found it to be sort of more emotionally deep in some ways than I found the book. I thought it had a real richness to it. So this is a cool book I would recommend if you wanted to pick up an interesting, theater book. But back to this book. This book is, I think, more of a straightforward adventure story than the stage adaptation made of it. The play really did streamline the plot, so there were a lot more twists and turns in this plot-wise that I didn't know exactly what to expect all of the time. This is also comedic, but the jokes were all different jokes. Like, literally, I think maybe there was one joke that was the same joke. So I got some fresh laughs out of reading this book. I got a bit more of a fleshed out adventure plot line, but other than that, given that I basically knew where it was going, I didn't really get a ton of value out of reading this book, because I feel like this is really a plot-driven adventure book, and I basically knew the plot. I could just really be putting the play on this immense pedestal in my mind, because when I encountered it, it was one of the best things I'd ever seen, so no other version of that story is really going to do that for me, I don't think. So yeah, I gave this 3 stars because I enjoyed reading it. It was a lighter middle grade story, which I had been wanting, but I'm hoping to find some middle grade soon that I like better than this. I don't think I'll be continuing on with this series. So at this point in the month, it had been a really long time since I had read a book that for me was a 5-star book. I think the last one had been in February or so, and I wasn't really reading any like 1 or 2-star books, so I was enjoying everything I was reading, but I was wondering for a long time, like, when's my next 5-star love this so much book happening? And I was not expecting this book to be it, and it was wonderful. This is The Philosopher Kings by Jo Walton. It's the 2nd book in her Thessaly trilogy, the 1st book of which is The Just City, which I read a little while before I started book 2. The 3rd and final book, Necessity, is not out yet. It is coming out, I think, on July 12th, and I am now super excited. The premise of this series is... okay, so the Greek goddess Athena decides to set up Plato's Republic in reality in an island in the distant past in like Bronze Era Greece that she knows is going to eventually be wiped away by a volcano, so there will be no evidence of its existence. And she pulls people from all throughout history to set up Plato's Republic and see if it could really work, and if not, what might go wrong with it. At the beginning of the 1st book, Apollo comes to her with some questions. There are some things he'd like to learn, and she suggests that he should try incarnating himself as a mortal in her Just City experiment to try to learn these things. There are 3 point-of-view first-person narrators in each book. 2 of them are the same for the 2nd book, 1 of them is new. This, interestingly, is another book that takes place a generation after the 1st book. What I really most appreciate about these books is how much Jo Walton does so much research and then presents it all in a way that you don't have to. She makes everything that's like really dense philosophy and intense history and stuff really, really accessible, even like I had never read Plato's Republic. I haven't really studied philosophy. I didn't know a bunch of the historical figures that come up in these books. And then she turns these ideas that are honestly pretty dry sometimes in the ways that they're presented into something that's very lived in and emotional and real and compelling as fiction, and with characters that I really, really cared about. And I think that's just an incredible feat for a writer to pull off, and I am in awe of it. And I am even more in awe of it, in this book. I am in awe of this book. I'm not totally sure what it was that made this book even more wonderful and compelling for me than the 1st book. It's maybe even a little more messy and raw and emotional and real in some ways. Obviously, that's what I admired to an extent in the 1st book, but the 1st book still was setting up something, I guess, really structured in terms of, well, here's how it's going to go, trying to set up the Just City, and here are all the ways we're going to do this. And by the time we get to this book, some things have gone not according to plan, things are kind of spiraling out of control. Apollo has learned what he thought he was there to learn, but it turns out there's a whole lot more to the experience of living a mortal life that he is struggling to cope with. I was really pulled into this, and I can't say a ton more about the plot because it's a sequel, but I have to say the third book is supposed to take place on a distant planet in the distant future, doing Plato's Republic in space with aliens, and I want it. If any writer can do that, Joe Walton can do that, yeah, I'm delighted. The last book I read in the month of May was the one that I've been looking forward to reading for a very long time, ever since it was first released, and I finally got around to it. And that is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This has gotten a lot of booktube hype, a lot of really positive reviews, especially, it seems, from people who read a lot of YA. Even though this is an adult fantasy novel, it does have a teenage protagonist, and it does read a little bit like YA. More recently, I've been seeing some people who did not like this book so much on booktube, but I was still very excited to read this book because it's basically a type of book that I generally enjoy no matter what. And that's folklore fairy tale inspired fantasy in a magical kingdom with a young female protagonist. It's a standalone, and I tend to really like that in fantasy novels. And it also does have this crossover adult YA appeal, and that also tends to be something I really like. I tend to like fantasy books that live somewhere in the crossover gray zone between adult and YA appeal. And so when it comes to this type of fantasy book, I feel like I'm not really that discerning, because if you're already giving me magical woods and castles and villages and ball gowns and clumsy heroines and things, I'm already like there. I'm on board. I will say, and this is part of what I think is confusing some people about the huge amount of hype this book is getting, it is a little more formulaic than I was expecting. The protagonist of this book is a girl named Agnieszka who lives in a village in a valley where there is an evil wood that is held at bay by a wizard. He's known as the dragon. He's a kind of grumpy character. I actually saw him in my mind the whole time as looking like Lord Blackheart from Nimona. I can't be, did anyone else, I don't know, it might have just been the closeness in time in which I read these books. Anyways, but the dragon takes every 10 years from the valley a girl who serves him in his tower for 10 years till he lets her go. And it's not really known why. So it's pretty clear what's going to happen to Agnieszka in this book. And then from there, there's a lot of learning magic things, and there's political intrigue at court, and by the time it gets towards the end, there are some big magical battles. So I didn't really mind any of these formulaic elements so much, but I was, for most of the book, looking for whatever it was going to be that was setting this book apart and Naomi Novik's writing apart from the other writers I read who write generally what I think of as this type of fantasy. So like Robin McKinley and Juliet Marillier. And for most of it, I was picking up only a little bit on the way that she writes magic is really, really beautiful, especially Agnieszka's relationship to her own magic and how it connects to sort of her emotional growth and her through line as a character. But that was really, really subtle to me until the very end of the book. And the last 2 or 3 chapters, I won't tell you anything about what happens, but they were just, those last few chapters were just really indescribably beautiful in a way that I had sort of given up on expecting for the majority of this book. And then the very end just had this ethereal, magical, mysterious gorgeous storytelling quality that is sort of why I love the fantasy genre to begin with. So my main quibble with this book was that I sort of wish there had been more of that type of storytelling throughout, and in retrospect I see where it was all coming from and where it was all building from. I just sort of wish that mode of storytelling had taken precedence a little earlier. So I'm not feeling particularly tempted right now to go back and read Naomi Novik's alternate Napoleonic Wars with Dragons series, but if she ever writes another book like this that's sort of fairy tale folklore fantasy, I'll definitely pick it up because I'm very intrigued, and I gave this 4 stars, so I really did enjoy this. Okay, that is everything I read in the month of May. I think this is going to be a very long video, so thank you for sticking with me, if you did stick with me. So I was editing this video and I realized that it was indeed incredibly overlong, so I decided to cut out the part where I talked about The Rose and the Dagger, which is the second book in the Wrath of John duology. I did also read that this month, but if you want to know what I thought of it, you can check out my series review for the duology, in which I gave pretty much all of my feelings about that book, and so it wasn't going to be adding even more extra time length here. But yes, that was one more book that I read this month. And I will see you very soon with my TBR for the month of June. If you have read any of these books and you want to talk to me about my opinions on them, or you want to tell me your opinions on them, or if you want to tell me something that you read in the month of May that you really liked or really didn't like, or just, you know, anything, books, leave a comment. I will be happy to hear from you. All right, that is all. Bye for now.